Great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 7:02 by my time, at least here in Appalachian, Virginia. I'm really grateful to have many of you back from last week, and I'm sure more folks still joining us. If you are attending for the first time this evening, I hope that you had a chance to watch the recording from last time. Pretty foundational to our discussion tonight, but if you didn't, you can always still watch it. Oliver Lippy with Future Generations is assisting me tonight. He'll be going through your questions. We'll remind you again to please stay on mute. And then as the conversation unfolds, as I wind down my presentation, please feel free to enter questions and comments in the chat box. And then Oliver will be reading through them. And as soon as I'm done presenting, we'll jump into the questions and whatever insights you all are bringing out there. We will again tonight, for the second week in a row, be focused on what's wrong with the situation, the underlying causes. The trajectory of this four-part series, that's the way we had planned it out, to really dive in deeply. So for those of you who want to get to solutions, you want to know what we can do about it, we're getting there, but we're not quite there tonight. So hang tight. Next week, we'll be joined by a dear friend and fabulous collaborator named Erica Edelson, who wrote the book Beyond Contempt. And Erica will help us make this transition from the problem to the solution. She's going to talk a little bit about problems of language and messaging, and then help shift gears towards what we can do differently in that regard and others. So next week, we'll begin to shift towards steps we can take. We may break into some small groups next week as well. We'll see the size of our group and how that might work. And then the fourth and final week will be focused entirely on what we can do. And more than likely, we'll be doing some of that work in small groups. So appreciate again, everybody being back for another session of the Rural-Urban Divide. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And before I do, I want to again thank Future Generations University for sponsoring this series. I'm fortunate to be on the board and also to teach a class as an adjunct faculty. Terrific organization, as I said last week, that grew out of the practice of building a more just and sustainable world. Also to our wonderful co-hosts, Appalachian Voices, which is on the leading edge of working to build a just and sustainable transition in Appalachia. And I have the privilege of working with a number of the folks on the call in that effort. And then Lichen Knowledge out of Kentucky that connects the academic and intellectual resources of universities with folks working on the ground to build a better, more sustainable place-based economies throughout Appalachia. So some terrific co-hosts. We'll go ahead and jump right in. So thanks again. We're into part two of the Rural-Urban Divide, and I'm going to start with a bit of a recap. I want to remind people who are here and those that didn't make it that last week we focused on two of the six underlying causes, really kind of what I would consider the foundational ones. First, the fact that the economy has failed most people in the United States, most Americans, and particularly and spectacularly so in most rural areas. From stagnating wages to increasing economic insecurity, just this extraction of wealth from working people, from small businesses, from family farms, from local communities, and how that has led not only to all the economic problems, but to tremendous social, health, and other problems that have eroded communities in countless areas across the country. And that second, kind of growing out of and building upon, capitalizing, you might say, on that economic situation is this widespread anger and resentment towards elites with, as Kathy Kramer so wonderfully articulated it from her investigation last time, elites being in the minds of many working folks in the country, city people, public employees, including even school teachers, academics, and certainly the media and the liberal culture. That anger at elites that Kathy talked about has also cultivated a really deep skepticism. It's a partisan skepticism at this point, as you can see, for a lot of reasons that we won't talk about tonight. But you can see that since the end of the last century, the phenomenal drop in trust in the media from the kind of mid 40% among Republicans down to around 10% now. This would be the mainstream media or mass media. Now we're talking about Republicans and Democrats here, but you could pretty well correlate that with a largely rural audience, certainly not entirely, but that very low trust in the media is certainly a feature of many rural people. And it's led to something that Kathy didn't exactly discuss, but this anti-elitism is also behind what many liberals are baffled by, which is why don't country people, why don't conservatives pay attention to the experts? Why don't they listen to these people? These are the people who know. Well, of course, again, the right-wing media has fomented a lot of that skepticism. But it's also the case that the experts aren't always right. The experts that liberal and progressive people tend to rely on very heavily have also made some pretty bold pronouncements, like when Bill Clinton and his Treasury Secretary said that NAFTA would create 1 million new jobs over 5 years, and really quite the opposite happened, including particularly in many rural areas and small towns where job loss was severe. And even a little more esoteric, but profoundly important, when Alan Greenspan in the 90s said there was no need to regulate this new thing on Wall Street called derivatives because the market would self-regulate. And almost 20 years later, Greenspan was doing a bit of a mea culpa because Wall Street had just about destroyed the economy and had absolutely destroyed the wealth of millions upon millions of working people and middle-class families. So the experts aren't always right. And a really telling example of this as well came out of a conversation I got to see between a gentleman in Massachusetts and a woman named Gwen Johnson in Letcher County, Kentucky. It's part of the Hands Across the Hills series that's going on. Really an amazing conversation. But at one point, the man from Massachusetts, I might have said wrong, from Massachusetts, asked Gwen why the vaccination resistance was so strong in Letcher County. And she basically said OxyContin, that they had been assured by the experts, the doctors, the pharmacists, and the regulators that it was non-addictive, perfectly safe. They could take it as much as they wanted. And of course, we know that was the beginning of the opioid disaster that has been so hard on so many communities in the country. I want to also quickly respond to some of the comments that emerged either in the chat box or the Padlet. Now, I'm not going to do them all justice, but I want to recognize some of them. I'm going to recognize first that a couple of different people spoke about the reality of extraction, that many rural communities and rural economies have been extracted from, whether it was coal or oil or gas, or whether it was tobacco or commodity foods or timber. And while rural communities vary a lot, and one of our participants, Betsy Taylor, pointed this out, that there's quite a bit of variability in rural communities, both in terms of their economic base and even the dynamics within them. What I want to focus on is that one commonality, whether it's a mining area, a timber area, fishing area, or agricultural area, or some mix, is that this economic extraction is a commonality. And so one thing that has left me to kind of challenge is the idea when I hear people say that rural places have been left behind. And that sort of implies that they're old-fashioned, outdated, outmoded from another era. But in fact, most rural communities have modernized most of the main rural industries, the timber industry, the fishing industry, agriculture, mining. They've all been in a process of pretty steady modernization for a number of generations, but that has not protected them from dramatic job loss, from ecological and health problems. That technological modernization, in fact, has in many cases contributed to them. So our approach, when we talk about being left behind, it sounds like we just need to bring them up to speed, but actually rural communities have been trying to come up to speed and still have largely been shafted, much like we've done in relation to so many developing countries in our relationship with them. So with those caveats, with those kind of response to some comments underway, let's talk about the 3 or 4, actually, I might get to 4 more of the underlying causes of the divide. So the third is this, this anti-regulatory element, which is extremely strong in rural communities. I've seen it around the coal industry, from farmers and others. And it's, of course, part of a broader drop in trust in the government, which is not just a rural phenomenon. Americans as a whole have lost a lot of trust in the government. But it is pretty acute in rural communities, small towns, and among small business owners, family farmers. In my campaign, I had a little house party, which you do those kinds of things all over the place, in Carroll County, Virginia. And after I'd done my little pitch, this group of a couple dozen folks were milling about, and a woman motioned for me to come over. She'd mentioned that she was a retail store owner, had a little grocery store in that town. And she signaled me to come over, and we were chatting, and she said, look, if you get elected, there's only one thing I want from you. I just want one thing. And when I asked her what that was, she said, leave me alone. I just want you to leave me alone. And so we started on a conversation then about what that meant. And as a small farmer who sometimes struggles with some of the regulations around farming and food safety, I was relating to some of what she said. But that sentiment that what small businesses want, what farmers want, what a lot of rural people want, is just for the government to leave them alone, is really quite common. Now, here's an interesting little sidebar to that story. As she and I were talking, there was a few other folks, her neighbors, who were having a conversation about an abandoned gas station, service station in the community. And apparently it had been abandoned for a number of years. And now the underground tanks were leaking fuel into a nearby creek in the groundwater. And these neighbors were rightly very upset about this. And the woman who had told me she just wanted to be left alone said to joined the conversation and said, somebody's got to do something. Somebody has got to get that guy to stop that. At which time I looked at her and said, yeah, but don't you think he just wants to be left alone? So, you know, it's sort of a two-edged sword, this being left alone. But the reality is that rural people's lives are much more intimately connected to the environment than people living in cities and suburbs. We're all ultimately, of course, dependent on a healthy environment, but rural people, a lot of us, are much more dependent on a healthy environment. And yet, this, what I've called regulatory aversion, has become really widespread. And this regulatory aversion, which, if you're interested, I wrote an article about this a couple of years back, and it's in the Stansberry Forum, which, by the way, I highly recommend is a great place for some progressive views on labor issues, the environment, and politics. Great online forum. But this idea of regulatory aversion is the belief that regulations don't work. They're not necessary and they're intrusive. And again, the normal liberal response to that, the kind of educated response to that when people talk negatively about regulations, is to try to explain just how important regulations are for protecting health, workers, children, safety, consumers, and the environment. All of that's true. But if you're in southern West Virginia, where the upper Big Branch mine exploded 11 years ago in April of 2010, killing 29 men, you might have a little different take on regulations, because the mine that blew up had been cited over 50 times for safety irregularities, safety violations in the month before the explosion, and over 500 times in the year prior. And yet, there was almost nothing that was done to address the safety violation. So from the standpoint of a lot of folks, it seems that regulations really don't protect the little guy, the working person, but they're more to protect big corporations. The fourth underlying cause is what Arlie Hochschild has called people beginning to feel like strangers in their own land. Some of you may have read Arlie's book by that title. And what she did in that book, much like Kathy Kramer explained to you how she went and visited with people in their home, on their home turf in rural Wisconsin over the course of several years, Arlie did that with about a dozen households whom she came to know very well in rural Louisiana. And what she found among these rural Louisianans was this very strong sense of being displaced and passed by, and that oftentimes they were blaming others for what they considered to be butting in line, and that other was often an immigrant or a person of color, not exclusively, but that was often the case. And so as Kathy described, a kind of integration or melding of racial resentment with a real sense of being treated unjustly or being displaced yourself, Arlie saw that as well in rural Louisiana. So this sense of being somebody who's worked hard, done their best, and yet now they're getting nowhere, but other people are getting ahead of them. It's been racialized and it's been exploited, of course, by some voices, but this culture of grievance is something that I think too often people on the left simply dismiss as white privilege, when, while it is that in some respects, it also really is something that's rooted in their experience. Eric Ward, who's an African-American gentleman that directs the Western State Center, where a lot of this anti-government sentiment is very strong, he calls out the left for saying that when this demographic anxiety, this sense of losing ground, that your group is no longer the boss, that you're no longer the group that's sort of favored, that when that's framed just as racism, you do miss some important underlying things. And that the reality is that it's, according to Eric Ward at least, kind of a natural response to rapid demographic change. Jennifer Silva, who we're getting to know through some of our national efforts about the rural-urban divide. Her book, We're Still Here, that looks at a post-coal community in Southwest Pennsylvania. She found that this alienation, this sense of being strangers in their own land, was true not only of the white people and white families that she met and came to know in Southwest Pennsylvania, but also of the Latino and African-American families that had oftentimes more recently moved into that region. They had very different take on politics and a lot of things from the white residents there. But she said that across race and gender, there was this deep mistrust of government and the larger social institutions. So much so that people felt that participating in politics was a joke. And Jennifer, in fact, said that when she wore her I voted sticker around town in 2020, she was mocked and chastised by people because they thought that participating in the political process was essentially pointless. So we have this anti-elitism that has emerged and has focused on city people, people with more formal education, people with desk jobs, the experts. We have this widespread sense of alienation that's not unique to rural communities, but is more pervasive and I think more profound in rural communities, a sense that the government, the culture, and the economy have all abandoned people. And then the reality that I don't know that everybody on this call is a liberal or progressive, I'm not presuming that, but most liberal and progressive leaders, politicians, and organizations have frequently played right into this narrative. And first of that, with a movement away from kind of a focus on working people and working people's issues towards more of a adoption of the perspective of the highly educated, the sort of educational elites, the tech superstars, and what some people call the cultural creatives. So all of these things, all of these types of folks, the education superstars, tech, and cultural creatives are much more strongly associated with urban centers rather than rural communities. This liberal urban culture I know that this is played out through the media, but I've also seen it firsthand, personally, in countless gatherings and meetings. We tend to celebrate the new, the cool, the different, the cutting edge, the out of the box. And whether that's high tech or whether that's craft breweries, craft distilleries, craft cideries, artisanal food and farming, whether it's kind of wellness, wholeness, mindfulness, self-care, we have this embrace on the liberal side, the progressive side, of kind of new ways of thinking, talking, being. And what that's not bad. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's quite a contrast to what many rural people see and experience. So Jennifer Silva, again, in her book, We're Still Here, she talks about how she says that coal fueled the Industrial Revolution, heated homes, won wars, and built fortunes, transforming a predominantly rural nation into the world's greatest powerhouse. Coal companies extracted value from the natural resources until coal was no longer profitable, then deserted mining communities and left behind a reserve army of workers nostalgic for better days. Today, calls for bringing back coal conjure up a spirit of rebellious determination, a refusal to abandon the glory of America's past legacy and the sense of cultural recognition and pride that accompanied it. So the point that I think she's making, or that I want to build on in the point she's making, is again, not that we should be promises about bringing back coal or other sorts of industries that no longer are sustainable, no longer can fit, but that if we don't recognize the deep sense of pride that many people had, whether they were coal miners or oil rig workers or farmers, there's this sense that we're the folks that built this country, that we're the folks that made it into this singular nation, and now we sort of feel like we don't fit anymore. And from Erica Edelson's book, and Erica will be joining us next week, so I'm not going to say too much of her perspective, but she does at one point cite how Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, who's maintained a position of power throughout the years, including the Obama administration, within the Democratic Party, and is considered a semi-liberal economist, that he basically admitted that displaced white workers weren't heavily on the radar screen of his party, that instead the Democratic Party had become a coalition of the cosmopolitan elite and diversity. And as Erica points out, this cosmopolitan elite, because they're highly educated, affluent, worldly, traveling and communicating globally, they benefit from globalization. That's what they see, while the myriad downsides, as she says, are largely invisible to this elite. That same sense of living in another world that is somehow so different from the world that's being presented through the liberal media. Sarah Smarsh, fantastic writer from rural Kansas, who grew up on a hardscrabble farm, whose family both farmed and did working class blue collar work. She was the first person to go away to college in her family, and she was surrounded, her college classmates, mostly by people from the bigger cities in Kansas and elsewhere, mostly from a much more urban and suburban elite kind of background. And as she came to know them and talked to them about her upbringing on this farm and this working class family, they were aghast and astonished. They told her at times that it was like listening to or reading, the stories of the Dust Bowl, of the Great Migration. And she said that, referring to her classmates, she said, they thought we didn't exist anymore, when in fact we just existed in places they never went. So again, the sense that the rural area is completely overlooked. A friend on a call recently, a rural urban divide call, said to me that when she hears this phrase about people voting against their own interests, she said, do people really vote against their own interests, or are they voting for people who show an interest in them? I think that's a really provocative and good way to reframe that question. Michael Lind in The New Class War, he goes a little bit one step further about this alienation and identifies what he calls a managerial overclass that is aligned with the rich. It's not rich, the folks are not rich themselves, but it's the people, the bureaucrats, the administrators, and others who basically make and enforce the rules that pretty much everybody has to live by. Now, again, we need people to do that, but for many rural people, small businesses, farmers, working folks, they're really quite tired of being told how to live their lives, of all the rules. And as Kathy said, people in rural communities who had lived on the land for many years felt resentment towards the experts who came from whatever it was, the Department of Natural Resources or whatever, to tell them how to do things differently. And so this sense, again, of other people from far away, usually the cities, making the rules, telling me how to live my life, what to eat, what to say and not to say, leads to this kind of rebellion against what some people call the woke culture of folks always kind of trying to say, this is how you should be. Back to Erica's book, an excerpt from this is a woman that she interviewed named Christina. So the question of people feeling alienated, this puts, I think, a real human face on it. Christina was somebody who grew up in a small town, in a religious family, had over time become more liberal herself, but she explains in the conversation with Erica, she says, I know it's hard to believe a member of the dominant race and or religion of the country could honestly consider themselves a besieged underdog, but people really believe this. It's actually very easy to believe that your own small town or local religious community is an isolated pocket of sanity in a hedonistic liberal world. And this is a very dense quote, but this comes from an article written by Andrew Levison, who's quite an astute an analyst of all of this. He's looking at a poll that was done. It was actually focus groups with conservatives just this past spring. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, but the takeaways here are that for many white working class and small town people, this kind of new world, which is presented often in the media as a very multicultural, multiracial world, but also a very economically progressive and highly advanced urban sort of culture that many white working class and small town people don't see themselves in that world. They don't feel they have a place in it. And he says that's pretty plausible when you consider how rarely small town life or the kind of blue collar jobs, the manual labor jobs, are positively portrayed by the main media, the mass media. And so this sense of not fitting in, again, is clearly strong among rural people in the white working class. The last thing, and I've just got a couple before we turn it over to our conversation, it's the final point in this. Now, next week, we're going to come back and talk about one other element of the underlying cause, which is our communication. This is really critical, but I'm punting that until next week when Erica will help lead that discussion, because that's her focus and her expertise. But there is this reality that with our two-party system, we have one party, the Democratic Party, which over the last 40 years has moved towards the center, generally speaking, at least in terms of its main voices and politics, and kind of a technocratic approach. And an article written 4 years ago, quoted by Thomas Frank, it was called More Professionalism, Less Populism, was advising exactly that. It declared that, like it or not, most of what government does simply must be decided by specialists and professionals. And these two authors, in fact, argued for a new professional class to set the economic and political agenda. That's exactly what Thomas Lind argued was part of the problem, was what he called this managerial overclass, or this new professional class. So Thomas Frank, in his book, The People Know, he says the problem with centrism is that technocratic competence isn't enough, especially when that competence somehow never means improving the lives of working people. And I've been very critical about the politics of incrementalism, which is something that I've been focused on the last several years. And, it's this idea that the system basically works. It needs some tweaks. It's not perfect, but it needs some, a little bit of work around the edges. And you heard that when Donald Trump was making the "Make America Great" quote central to his campaign. Hillary Clinton said, "America's already great." Now, of course, there's truth to that in a number of respects. But the problem with that approach, from the standpoint of folks who aren't doing well, is if you're somebody who's doing pretty good, if your job's solid, your neighborhood's safe, your family has access to health care, you're healthy, an incremental approach probably makes sense. But if you are struggling personally to make ends meet, or your community is unraveling, losing kids, losing jobs, if your children's prospects are bleak, then incrementalism is not a solution, it's an insult, because it does not recognize the severity of the situation you're in. So I'm going to stop there. We've got about almost 30 minutes for discussion and comments. So let's get into that right now. And I don't know if there's some already queued up, but I'll turn it over to Oliver to help us find those questions.
Yeah, sure. So first question is from Erica. It says, are people of color in rural areas also alienated by the dictates of woke culture, or is that mainly an issue for rural whites?
Yeah, I have my experience is all I can share on that, Erica, because I've not looked at, research or whether or not there have been polls or focus groups of people of color in rural areas around that issue. But in my experience, the answer is generally yes. Not as intensely as some white folks, because people of color in rural areas are not necessarily watching the same news sources that some of their white neighbors are. But certainly some of my Black farmer friends, some of my friends who are in, I would say, not professional occupations, but let's say working class occupations who are Latino in our area, they're also kind of dismissive of woke culture. They're not as angered by it, but they think it's kind of silly. They think it's kind of over the top or maybe beside the point. That's what I've heard. Now, that's purely anecdotal from my experience, but that's what I've heard.
And then a follow-up to that from Erica as well. Says, how are rural folks getting exposed to the so-called woke culture? Is their main exposure what they hear filtered through right-wing media? Or in what other ways are they hearing prescriptions for what they should be believing and how they should be talking?
Well, I'd say the main entree there, the main filter is indeed right-wing media, whether it's on whether it's Facebook based or whether it's the local talk radio or Fox News. But it's not only that, because the other exposure they have to it is oftentimes liberal political candidates or liberal people who are part of an organization. They may be political candidates or organizations that are in that same region, or they may be outsiders who are visiting and trying to make the case for either a candidacy or an issue. But some of that same expectation, some of that same kind of normative language will come through in those experiences as well. So it isn't all just right-wing media. It's sometimes a very personal experience of how liberal and progressive folks seem to speak to them and seem to expect them to respond.
Great. Next question is from Clara. It says, predominantly rural states are overrepresented politically in Congress based on the structure of the Senate. And for rural people who feel that government doesn't represent or respond to them, how do they reconcile the disproportionate political power they appear to have with the lack of investment in rural communities?
Yeah, that is so true. And both sides of that are in fact true. On the one hand, there's no question that rural areas are disproportionately represented through the Senate. And now with the way districts are drawn, oftentimes in the House as well. There's no denying that. So politically, at one level, rural voters exercise more power, which leads to all kinds of outcomes. What it hasn't translated to is actually more investment in rural communities. Two studies done in just the last decade for sure, I would say maybe even the last 6 or 7 years. One of them looked at philanthropic dollars, and one of them looked at public federal dollars. And in both cases, they found that per capita, rural areas got decidedly less investment than urban areas. So that means adjusting for the big differences in population. Rural communities were getting less philanthropic money and less federal dollars per person than urban areas. So even though rural areas have had and continue to have maybe even growing disproportionate political influence to their numbers, it hasn't led to more investment in their communities, and it hasn't led to better policies that might actually help rural communities build out the new economic transitions, the new economies that are underway but under resourced in our community. So it's this terrible irony that has certainly not helped what liberal and progressive people want, but neither has it really translated to helping what rural people want, at least not on economic and health issues.
This one's from David. It says, every community of color can lay claim to the lack of seeing themselves in the broader culture, yet they continue to be reliable Democratic voters. Why do white rural communities react so differently? So kind of building off of that point of rural people and their representation in media.
Yeah, well, and you could say another maybe similar comment, David, might be, why aren't people of color way more pissed off? If rural white people have plenty of reason to be pissed off, and I think they do, you can absolutely make the argument that people of color, whether African Americans, indigenous people, or Latinos, have much more longer standing, deeper and broader reasons to be pissed off. Well, two things. One is that I think that this last election cycle shows that people of color are not necessarily wed to the Democratic Party in perpetuity. While they certainly voted for Joe Biden in large numbers over Donald Trump, those numbers are declining fairly strongly over the last several election cycles. So people of color are shifting towards Republicans at multiple levels and towards more conservatives. And part of that is, I think, because they're sick and tired of being taken for granted and being kind of treated as a block, Black people, Latinx, whatever. Yet they are certainly a much more reliably Democratic constituency than white rural people. I think the other thing is that white rural people have been through this, the early stages of this economic transition, and they've seen their fortunes in a fairly steady state of decline. And unlike communities of color, historically, they're not used to that. I mean, the plain truth is that white people are used to kind of being on top. And so as that has shifted, I think it has led to, as Kathy Kramer said last week, many of these factors have created fertile ground for disinformation, fertile ground for rapid shifts in government. And I think it comes from this sense of being kind of newly alienated from politics and culture and the economy.
This one's from Katie. It says, has anyone looked into how the current spread of rural broadband might change any of this? I've heard some rural people complain that they've been left out in terms of the opportunities that the internet affords. Do you think that the current push to bring rural areas up to speed, pun intended, will ameliorate some of these feelings in any way?
Katie, I don't think in the short run it will. I mean, I think we would all agree, and across the political spectrum, there's pretty much agreement that broadband is an essential infrastructure now, like water and sewer and so many other things. And that rural communities, along with some pockets in urban areas as well, but certainly rural communities by and large have much spottier, poorer access to it. Fixing that is a priority for most rural economic development people. It's a priority for at least some politicians from rural areas. And it's beginning to happen. There's certainly been a lot of progress, but whether or not that would really impact the sense around the rural-urban divide, I'm not so sure, because the main people who will benefit from greater broadband access are the kind of entrepreneurial class that are looking for new types of businesses and to be able to be working from home, people with new products looking for new markets, young people, both students and young people building out their lives and their careers. I mean, we'll all benefit from telemedicine and all of that, but I guess my point is that I think that the rural broadband will help accelerate economic transition in rural communities and help build the new economies that many of us are trying to build in rural communities. But I'm not so sure how much positive impact that will have on the perspective of people who already feel very alien. I'm not sure that broadband will change that significantly, especially since we have virtually no control over the discourse that takes place on the internet, and so much of which contributes to the divide. So we need it. It'll help. I think economically, it'll help in other ways, but I don't know that it'll impact the divide.
This one is from Stephen, and it's just to summarize, because there's a lot to unpack in this, Stephen. Acknowledging that the economy is moving away from rural areas into the city, and that families, he asked a question last week about families and what they want for their children. It's for children to go to cities to get jobs, to go to university in cities. So the question is it just the older people in these communities that express themselves in the ways that we've been discussing? Is the perception that we're studying only capturing the older voice in those rural areas?
So the answer to that is no. It's probably stronger as a group among middle-aged and older people, but there's plenty of young people in rural communities that share this same perspective. Carrie Warren Couch, that's on this call, she might, if we have a time, get to speak to this, but she shared with me a story about a couple of young fellows that were helping her put up hay on her farm in Illinois. This was just, I think, last week, very recently. Both of whom spoke out in different ways, but basically very, very anti the new administration and very concerned about the direction of the country. That's just one of a lot of examples. I have plenty from my own experience of young people. So it isn't just among old people, though it's probably more intense and more common there. I'd also say, in terms of your comment in the chat, that the economy has moved away from rural communities, but the people haven't moved. So isn't that like being left behind? To some degree, there's truth to that, but I would challenge that as well, because when you say the economy has moved away from rural communities, the reality is that rural places still provide the vast majority of the sustenance that most of us need: the food, the fiber, the building materials, the raw ingredients for everything from lumber to cement, all the different dimensions of our food economy, from commodity agriculture to produce and meats and fish, and energy. And the jobs have moved away from rural areas, but the economy hasn't moved. We're still, as a nation, very, very dependent on well-functioning rural places, because that's where we get most of our stuff. That has not changed. There's an urban ag movement. There's high-tech, multi-level indoor farming. There's a variety of things we can do in cities, but we are still highly dependent on our rural places for the provisions that all of us need. food, fiber, energy, water, etc., and the ecological services to process all that. The question is, have we developed policy that maximizes jobs or minimizes jobs in the process? Have we developed policy that makes what industrial base is still there more transient or more permanent? So I would say that lots of those policies have unnecessarily denuded rural communities and sent jobs overseas or replaced them with capital. You certainly see that, for instance, in the farming industry with the movement of IBS and the big giants that are now basically making factory farming the norm. When you have somebody like Tyson who has contract laborers instead of farmers raising their hogs and their poultry, that means fewer jobs, much more risk to the contract farmers, many fewer ancillary jobs in the communities that would have supported mid-sized family farms. So in many different ways, the economy is still in rural areas, but the jobs have left.
Follow up to that, Anthony, also from Stephen, as just describing the trends of housing in cities getting really unaffordable, and with COVID, many people moving to more rural areas. Do you think that the mixing of those groups of people might have an impact on the viewpoints that we've been discussing?
Yeah, again, Stephen, I don't know the answer to that. I've not studied it. I've not seen a study of it. There's probably been one done. From my experience, it's a mixed bag. There's definitely some resentment of newcomers generally. I experienced that when I moved to the area about 40 years ago. It's not as widespread or as absolute as people often think, because there's also a countervein of welcoming new people, welcoming young people who've either come back or come to the area for the first time. And with that welcoming, there's also, I think, a softening of some of the elements of the divide. So one trend is that as people have moved in from cities, particularly people who've moved in and not immediately become too dominant of a voice in the community, people who've worked to kind of connect and ingratiate and understand, when people come in that way, I think most people receive them positively. And then I think that can wear off. And so some of the perceptions, some of the negative perceptions of urban people or liberal people can definitely be diminished by that exposure. On the other hand, there are people, and I know a number of them, who've come from the cities and just are wearing their frustration with the gaps and the lacks and the inadequacies of small town life on their sleeves. And when they do that, man, they just help build that resentment out 100-fold. So it really depends on the person and kind of how they enter the community and what they do there. I think there's real potential for that to make a positive difference, but it doesn't always.
From Betsy, given the alienation and loss of faith in government you described, what positive role can nonprofits and social movements play? And what are the mistakes that progressive nonprofits or social movements tend to make?
Yeah, there's definitely a role. And in fact, Betsy, I know you know this. There are a lot of nonprofits, whether they're health-based, whether they're focused on family farming, whether they're kind of new economy or economic transition oriented. There's a lot of nonprofits, social enterprises and the likes that are and have been working in small towns and rural communities for some time, and they are making a difference. They're not all successful. They don't all go about it the right way, but to the degree that they do meet people where they are, build on the strengths and the assets of the community, the human strengths and assets, the ecological, the cultural, and then start to help to create some new energy and vitality, I think they play a very important role. And they're perceived differently from governments, generally speaking. So they're not perceived as being so bureaucratic and dogmatic and kind of monitoring and managing as government folks might be. So yes, I think the short answer is absolutely they can and they do. I think the mistake that progressive nonprofits or social movements sometimes make is they will come to rural communities without first recognizing what's there and who's there. Wendell Berry had a great quote. Wendell's one of my longest, most influential mentors. And I can't remember the particular essay, but he was talking about kind of experts coming to small towns and rural communities. And he said of that, he said, we come with vision, but without sight. So when progressive organizations come to a region with vision, meaning we got an idea, this is going to work, this is way better than what you did, blah, 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 but without sight, without the willingness and the ability to see what is already there, strong and weak, good and bad, but to be willing to recognize those strengths and build on them, that's when it goes off the rails. That's when people get defensive and they don't want to be involved with a group like that. So we need to come with as much sight as vision.
From Alexis, says states with rural areas often get more federal funding. Why is it not making its way to the people who live there or making a noticeable impact on their communities? And are rural people holding their local governments accountable? David added to that the same holds true for state funding, right? Like every rural county in Washington receives more funding from the state than they contribute.
Yeah, and I don't know about Washington, but in Virginia, that's true as well. But a lot of that comes down to basically health and education. So in many respects, because rural communities have been losing population, it's been harder for them to sustain schools. Schools are much older, the building stock. Similarly with the health infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure, oftentimes hospitals are older, they're not as well staffed, et cetera. So it takes kind of more steady infusion of state and federal money to sustain those. Beyond the healthcare sector and education, I don't know if you factor those two out, whether it would be true that state and federal funding was disproportionately per capita going to rural communities. I suspect not, but I don't know that. So, it's not that it's all ineffective. It's not that it's not in any way getting to the people who need it. But there is this sense that whatever funding is coming, whether it's for public schools, that hasn't stopped the decline of public schools. We had a situation in Virginia recently in which a Democratic state legislator from Northern Virginia fought against successfully a proposed bill that would have created a constitutional amendment for equity in funding, regardless of geography in the state of Virginia. And it was voted down. And one of the Democratic legislators who fought against it said that people in places like Lee County, Virginia, which is close to where I am, one of the most rural counties in the state, one of the poorest counties in the state, needed to stop asking the state for money and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. So the idea there, again, was that you already get a whole lot more per capita than Fairfax County gets. You guys got to help yourselves. And so the problem with that understanding and that messaging is that it doesn't reflect the fact that those Northern Virginia counties have much higher median incomes, 2.5 and 3 times as high, and much higher property values and property tax rates, all of which means that they're able to fund their school systems mostly from local resources, and poor communities can't do that. So anyway, to the more basic questions, I think federal and state dollars may be getting to rural communities, but they're sort of getting there and holding their noses above the water. They're just barely above the water. What's been lacking is investments to really energize and develop strong local economies that are more self-sustaining and more resilient. There's a lot of work underway, which we'll be talking about a little bit, around Appalachia and many other parts of the country to do that, to build more self-sufficient and sustainable rural economies. But that's not where most of the state and federal dollars go.
From Harry and Gail, why do you think science and trust in scientists and other technology experts has become so politicized? Folks in rural areas seem to have much more disdain for those intellectual professionals than in more populous areas. University towns often are situated in rural areas and are blue dots in a red sea, yet they're usually regional economic engines.
So, Harry and Gail, great to see you. Yeah, I don't know what else I can say about that I didn't talk about earlier. I think it's a combination. Again, as I said at the beginning of the first session, I'm not spending much time talking about the profound and sustained impact that right-wing media has had on rural people's perspectives, lots of people's perspectives, but in this context, rural people's perspective. And that media and those spokespeople have made it their point to disdain academics, to disdain people that are highly credentialed, all of that. So that's obviously a part of it. But it is also the case that science and technology and the advice of experts hasn't always been either true or hasn't had positive impacts for people in small towns and rural communities. I mean, we can go back to Earl Butz, Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, telling farmers to get big or get out, that what they had to do was modernize their farms, plant fence row to fence row, and buy up any of the smaller farms. That was the advice of the Secretary of Agriculture. And while that worked for a very, very small group of farmers that are very, very large, to most farmers and to most rural communities that were substantially agriculture, it was devastating. So that is one of many, many examples when the scientists and the experts and the media voices echoing them have given advice that didn't work out well for countless people in small towns and rural communities. So I think the skepticism about science and technology is in part, this anti-elite stuff that is fostered and exacerbated by the media. But I think it also comes from a sense that the experts aren't always right. And by the way, we know a thing or two, and they never seem to ask us what we know, whether it's about how we manage our animals, how we manage our land, what we do to preserve health, how we build our own local economy. They don't tend, and I can speak to this personally, you don't tend to get the academics and the government people coming to the small towns to ask the farmers, the small businesses, the community bankers, the bootstrap people for their advice about what we need to do. It tends to be top down, and that tends to foster or contribute to the resentment.
Great, thanks, Anthony. I'm going to repost the links to Padlet and the Padlet help video in the chat again. So if you have any questions that come up to you, come out tomorrow or even tonight as you're processing this session, or takeaways, you can add to that Padlet. It's the same form we used last week. There's also a link to a help video if you'd like to walk through that, and that should help you sort out how to get on Padlet and ask those questions. I'm not seeing many other questions. There's a little bit of discussion in the chat, Anthony.
Yeah, I'll respond to Stephen's comment in the vein of this. Why do people not respect or appreciate the experts? And he says folks in rural areas do appreciate the applied science of agronomists and those who invent fertilizers, including at universities. No, and that's true. But one reason why, Stephen, is because the Cooperative Extension Service was a model that was created where you had a person in every single county who was usually, not always, but usually a farmer themselves, usually grew up in the community, who, while they were a conduit for expertise from the local land grant, they were also kind of one of the people in the community. They were somebody who struggled with the same challenges and struggles. And they spent most of their time on farms or farm-related businesses in a very kind of interactive way. So there was a tremendous sense of respect. And I'm not saying extension is perfect, but I've known a lot of county agents, I've known a lot of people at the land grants. They developed a camaraderie with local people and a respect because they respected local people. It was not like knowledge from on high that was transmitted. So maybe cooperative extension is a good model to consider about how to go about trying to overcome this kind of anti-elite, anti-expert culture, because extension definitely has gone about it in a different way with very different results. So we're at about 8:02. We probably should wrap up. I think that in addition to contributing to the Padlet, and we'll go back through the chat box and see if any questions we haven't answered. Next week, as I said, I'm really, really excited that Erica Edelson, who's been involved in this conversation through the chat box, is going to be presenting focused on what she found around language and what she calls the language of contempt. And Erica is going to help us make the shift from the focus on the problem to what we can do differently. And that transition will happen next week. And then we'll be laser focused on getting over this damn divide and making things better from here on out. Thank you all so much for your participation this evening. Would love to have you all come back next week. Hope you can. And again, thanks to our great sponsors for this event as well. Good night, everyone.